One of our series of talks in the Sheffield Treasures Project. This is a talk about pen and pocket knives, and it's looking at those pen and pocket knives that we've got in the Hawley collection, unpacking those aspects of the collection that are both interesting and different. The characteristic of a penknife is interesting. Originally, a penknife does what it says on the can. It was for cutting quills. The blade was small with a sharp razor edge. To hold the edge, the blade was very hard, it was easily chipped, and therefore it was sometimes broken, often found damaged because of misuse. The pocket knife was much stronger, multi-purpose, blades pivoted at the same end, blades pivoted at the opposite end, it's a penknife. More than two blades, it's a pocket knife. Now you'll never get any knife collectors to agree what are the definitions of pen and pocket knives. One way of cop-out, if you like, is to call them folding knives. How far back do folding knives go? Well, the Romans used folding knives, but without a spring. The Scandinavians used folding knives with organic handles. Folding knives seem to have gone out of fashion. In medieval times, single-purpose knives in a sheath that could be worn on the waist dominated. We've got that famous Chaucer quote, "A Sheffield thwittle bare in his hose," the thwittle being a crude knife, which often had a hook in the end or a circle in the end so you could attach it to your belt. 1596, we get the first reference to a Sheffield penknife with a fixed blade. By 1660, the mechanism of the folding knife had changed. The innovation of a strip of spring steel enabled the blade to be held open or closed, eliminating accidental opening, and probably led to the renaissance of the folding knife. We can look at the collection in a number of ways, and one of the things to say is, what are the oldest pen and pocket knives we've got in the collection? Now, we're really grateful to Simon Moore, who's one of the experts on knives in the country, and he's donated the knives that you can see in this picture, which have actually come out of the River Thames. You can sort of speculate, were these sailors that were sitting on the edge of the boat and they were just sharpening a bit of a stick? Was it people who were walking along the Thames? But whatever, they've been preserved in good condition. And the interesting thing is, the oldest of these knives, one of them by Thomas Mason, it goes back to 1637. His mark is a star with a T above it. Now, one of the interesting things about all these knives, an obvious thing to do would have been to have gone and looked in Geoffrey Tweedale's book. I looked up all these knives in Geoffrey Tweedale's books and they weren't there. So these knives go back even earlier than many of those knives that Jeff has catalogued so well in his book. And the reason we're able to track these knives down is that we've got copies in the Hawley collection of the original mark of the Cutlers Company. And as I've said before many times, if you were a knife maker in Sheffield and you wanted to come up with a mark, it was a bit of a challenge. What were you going to choose as your mark, and would it be different to one from anybody else? We can group knives into a number of different contexts, and one of those, which were fashionable in the past, were fruit knives. In 1750, the trend for folding fruit knives reached England from the continent. The first knives copied the fashion of the pistol grip handles and the scimitar blades, which were typical of the table knives at the time. There's also the question of, was it fashionable to have a fruit knife? Well, rumour has it that Charles II gave his mistress, Nell Gwyn, a French pocket knife. So therefore, if it was good enough for the royalty, it was good enough for everybody else. In 1790, A. Colmore, Birmingham Company, registered a mark in Sheffield, and there was tension with the French over Napoleon Bonaparte, and that killed off French imports and therefore gave a great impetus to the homegrown market and the home trade. Sheffield really did dominate the production of fruit knives in the country. The fashion was for knives made of gold and silver. Silver blades don't discolour with fruit acid. The advance in silver on copper fusion plating. 1773, the Asset Office in Sheffield opened. Prior to that, things were either sent to Chester, or if they're only small items, and some of the fruit knives were small, they didn't bother and they just put the maker's name on there. And you can see this knife, it's got the initials WF, and that was for William Fox, who was a prominent maker. This table just shows the importance of pen and pocket knives. And it surprised me when I saw it anyway, that the number of people employed in pen and pocket knives was so great. And by 1851, the number of people employed in pen and pocket knife industry was actually greater than the number of people employed in the table knife industry. And it's interesting, if you look at that growth between 1830 and 1851, very significant increase both in the table knife makers and in the pen and pocket knife makers. Now, when I was looking at the collection and getting ready for this talk, one of the things left me with a bit of a mystery. Some of the items in the collection, they've got silver blades, but only a lion and a king's head. So I was thinking, how on earth can we date these items? How can we work out how old they are? The hallmarks were large and had been hand struck. And one of the notions was actually, if you had loads of marks stamped on these knives, you took away from that actual beauty. So the only essential item on the blade was the sterling lion to say that it was silver. The date letter and the maker's mark were hidden by the tang by the assay office. It's an obvious thing actually, but the whole knife didn't go to the assay office. The only thing that went to the assay office was the blade, and therefore some of the information about the knife is actually hidden behind the tang. The other thing, from 1784, there was a duty tax payment was shown on the knives, and this was in the form of the monarch's head. And it was only in 1820 to get to the situation where they could create a jig that would show the hallmark quite clearly, but not too large, and therefore they conclude the whole lot of information. So this has helped us work out that actually some of the knives we've got in the collection were dated between 1780 and 1820. I'm eternally grateful to Simon Moore's book about fruit knives that's got a lot of that information in, and certainly that's essential reading. The other thing was, these were things to show off, these were things to brag about. So we got decoration on the scales, the combination of mother of pearl, which came from Australia, and silver blades said real quality. And of course, quality is one of the things that Sheffield's famous for. The pattern carved into the handles, it was often quite fine, but it was decorative, and it had patriotic symbols, sunbursts, anchors, flower arrangements were common at this time. And I suppose one of the things we could speculate, were these knives for men or were they for women, or perhaps were they for both? The other thing we got decoration. As the scimitar shape went out of fashion, alternative ways were used to make the knives look interesting. Decorative borders on the edge of the blades, and you can see a picture there. It's a wavy pounce pattern with dots from the 1800s, and other aspects of the knives were embellished, and you can see a picture there. We've got the cap, the bolster, the pins. The shield in these days was often left blank, and later on that became something where people would have had their initials, might have had the maker, it might have had a trade advert on it at some point. The last bit of decoration was the pattern along the back of the blade. Again, something that in a way doesn't have a function, but makes the thing look very attractive. And it's interesting, 200 years later, if you see any of the knives of the late Stan Shaw, you'll see fantastic decoration on the back of those knives. And lastly, sometimes they thought, well, we've made a fruit knife, but can we add anything to it? Can we differentiate our product? Can we give people something that's useful? And one of the things that's useful is an orange peeler or a fork. And so sometimes we get these combination sets of knives. There was a number of famous makers that were making these fruit knives: Aaron Hadfield, Martin and Hall, Henry Wilkinson, J.J. Bell, John Oxley, Henry Atkin, and John Yeoman at Cowlishaw. He was so famous, he actually had a name in Sheffield that was named after him. As time went on, we did get a change in fashion of the fruit knives. We got changes in technology. So we got silver plating was invented in 1850. A Victorian revival of patterns, Neo-Rococo, and gold and silver were all things that could be brought to embellish and decorate the fruit knives.
Just a bit back to pen knives. So this knife, which I don't think I've got out actually, but anyway. So this knife's got a fixed blade. It hasn't got a folding blade. And it's got this funny thing on the end. A spike for splitting feathers. You didn't sort of kill seagull, pull a feather, dip it in the ink, and you were off. You had to, it was a bit more work involved in that. And it was a short blade, and it wasn't actually silver. But that's something we have in the collection. The other thing is, just a range of handle materials. You've got bone. It's funny, when I've got my cutlery stall, people come up to me and say, "Oh, I used to have one of them bone handle knives," and actually they're synthetic. The sort of table knives that most of us were brought up with. But actually, going back further, they didn't have the advantage of synthetic materials. Hadn't been invented. So the dark one is tortoise shell. Again, where was the nearest tortoise? To Sheffield in 1750. Some of these ivory ones have got like pins in them that have been inlaid. But you can see that characteristic of the little brittle blade. So these almost certainly were very much in that sort of a penknife fashion. Yeah, and then, that's what they often end up with, half a blade. This object's quite interesting. So I unpacked this one day at the Hawley collection and thought, what on earth is this? On your left-hand side, that's in its folded shape, and also it came in a box, actually. Made by Joseph Rodgers, and actually anything made by Joseph Rodgers is worth getting excited about. It's got a slider on it, so you can slide out a knife at the end, which again doesn't look dissimilar to a penknife blade. But the fun bit actually is this other end. It's essentially a press. So you'd put a feather in there, you'd clamp it down, and it would give you a pen nib shape from your quill. It's not being used a lot, but if you haven't got one in your house, maybe you need one. Things erupted actually. It's almost like how many things can we put on the end of a pen or pocket knife? And you could spend all day actually thinking, what on earth are some of these things for? Okay. There was obviously, there's well, I don't know. You almost feel like every knife had something for taking something out of a horse's hoof. You had hooks for buttons or for corsets. You had needles. You had a pair of scissors. You had a saw, a comb. I hope you put the other blades in before you attempt to do any combing with it. Yeah, there's another comb later, so I'll save my comb for till then. We were number one in the world. Okay. And it was to do with the skill involved in the blade, hammering it, mooding, a sandwich of iron and fine steel, a little anvil, a stiddy. The best steel, high carbon steel that was being made in Sheffield. And we got all these advances in technology that were taking place in Sheffield. We've got the cementation furnaces, we've got Benjamin Hutzman's crucible steel, we've got the Bessemer convert. Just over a period of time, we were just coming along with another big innovation in the making of steel, in the grading of steel, that made it perfect for knife blades. And I don't know, about 6 months ago, there was some article, I think it was in the Times, and they were basically saying still all over the country, people who are making, knife blades, they still want Sheffield steel to do that. And again, there's a whole other topic, interest of the quality of Sheffield steel and the combinations that can be made. But the blades were hammered and rolled out to correct thickness, forged into blanks, polished and browned to produce a keen edge. I suppose you could argue it was all about the edge, wasn't it? If it didn't cut, there was no point having it. Something else came across in the collection. People started to talk about Barlow knives. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know, what's all that about? And essentially, we did have big cutlery companies in Sheffield, people like Wuston Home and Walker and Hall and Joseph Rodgers. But what we forget is that there were a whole load of significant rural metalworking industries all around the edge of Sheffield. There was scythe making, there was file cutting, but there were also pen and pocket knife makers. And most of these were made by a family called Furness family, and they were made up in Stannington. I'm not really quite sure about the dates, probably maybe from 1850s onwards, but again, there's something we've got in the collection, and they're quite unusual. And they're partly unusual because the sort of central core of the knife is this bit that's being cast. And sometimes actually the word Barlow actually appears on there. And the other nice thing was, I put a pint in a folding knife place, so many of these knives were made in pubs. Some of those places you might remember the Robin Hood pub that used to be in Loxley Valley, which is not there anymore, the Rivlin Hotel, which is still there and is actually booming. So some of the people, they operated a pub, but also when they weren't serving beer, they were actually making knives. And it's quite a common thing. So it's this extended bolster of exaggerated length, which became known as a Barlow knife, common at the end of the 18th century. It was a sort of simpler construction, therefore probably cheaper to make. Again, it's MF, that's the Furness family. Some examples here. So the public houses, the Little Matlock, that's Robin Hood, isn't it, in the Rivlin Hotel. The expert on this is a chap called Michael Dyson, who is actually still making and restoring knives, and he sometimes does a talk about the cutlers of Stannington. There is a booklet which has at times been available, I don't know whether it still is, from the Stannington Historical Society that was written by a chap called Dennis Smith, who actually was the owner of a large number of these knives that I'm actually showing today. And again, I'll just say briefly, so the Dennis Smith collection was a collection of about 1,000 knives that actually came into the possession of the Hawley collection. We didn't have to buy it. If it had gone on the open market, they would have been sold separately and they'd gone all over the country. Dennis was a mate of Ken Hawley's, and Michael Dyson helped us get that. But that was a really tremendous donation to fill a real gap in the picture of the collection that we've actually got. And the other thing is, so some of these knives have got IXL on them. IXL is one of Sheffield's most famous brands, Wolstenholme. I was telling somebody later, you see Wolstenholme spelt differently because they dropped a couple of the letters so the name would fit on a knife blade. But actually, when some of these were Nook Lane in Standington, which of course is still there, and these were in 1910. But so and Wolstenholme were famous for quality, but they were happy to have some outworking done. These knives maybe look a little bit cruder than some of the other knives that you might come across, but it may be they've been used. The next bit I'm just going to illustrate using one catalogue. One of the great things we've got about the Hawley collection, we've got the objects and we've often got the paperwork behind it. I've never done a talk about Thomas Turner, so this is as near as I'm going to get to it. Started in 1802, trademark Encore, which was granted in 1805. Now this one I thought, prize at the Great Exhibition 1851 for the Prince of Wales sailor's knife, 6 foot long. Straight on the internet, can I find a picture? No. Where is it? Well, it's probably in some private collector in America, sadly, but again, this is what Sheffield Cutlers did. They were bragging. The Great Exhibition was a fantastic opposition, saying, this is Sheffield, this is how good we are, and we'll make exceptional pieces. He was master cutler in 1871. He acquired a couple of other companies, Hobson Brothers, Wingfield, Rowbottom and Hayward's. He operated a penknife hospital. A chap earlier he's got a knife with a broken mother of pearl saying, where can I get that fixed? But there was a time when there was a penknife hospital. 1914 employed 800 men. 1932 went bankrupt. Fairly familiar Sheffield story. 1930s, 1960s, they were a trading arm of Viners. But the thing is, I went to the catalogue. There's nothing better than a cutlery catalogue, for me anyway. Now. Thomas Turner, Sheffield, England, manufacturers of hygienic stainless cutlery, Encore table cutlery, pen and pocket knives, razors, scissors, plated goods, files and tools. Okay, a bit of, Cutlers to the Majesty, so let's get all those things in. The 1925 catalogue, which is on there, there's 100 pages, but in that 100-page catalogue, 23 pages of pocket knives. So again, it's this thing, if you wanted a choice to buy a knife in Sheffield, the choice was just unlimited. One-blade pocket knives, Ettrick and lambsfoot knives, lambsfoot and castrating knives, which does what it says on the can, pruning knives, scribe pruning and plumber's knife, corn knives, budding knives, grafting knives. Spoilt for choice. So that was the one-blade knives, Ettrick and lambsfoot. Now, I must admit, I had to say, what is an Ettrick knife? Okay, and actually, it's almost and even the lambsfoot, they're almost like generic knives that people actually use for just whittling a bit of wood. But it does also say somewhere, lambsfoot knives, you could have trimmed a lamb's foot with one. And you will actually see the word Ettrick and the word lambsfoot stamped on the blades. One of the other things is they didn't come down to a very sharp point, which actually meant they were a bit stronger. So they're a bit for a more rough and ready wear than actually a penknife would have been. And then the other thing, of course, is you got the choice. Did you want a boxwood handle, a rosewood handle, a stag handle, a buffalo handle? So you had all the choices. So it wouldn't have been enough to go to one of these companies and said, I want a lambsfoot knife. It would be, which lambsfoot knife do you want? It would have been like talking to Ken Hawley in his shop, actually, I think. It's a picture of an Ettrick knife, and it's got Ettrick knife stamped on the blade. And probably, I don't know, it's probably a bone handle. And then so it goes through the list. So pruning knives, a scribe. So I know somebody in the audience looked at the one that's out there and said, oh, great. Can you tell me what that's for? And I said, it's a scribing knife. I said, oh, thank goodness for that. So that was good. A corn knife. Now, when I first saw a corn knife, I thought, well, that's obviously for eating corn on the cob, isn't it? It's not. It's corns on the feet. Pruning knife. The scale of something like that in terms of a pruning knife. And that scribe, actually, so that's got Encore. It's got that Thomas Turner logo on it, Encore, and the diamonds. I love this. This is a page in the catalogue, okay? And sometimes when in a modern world, people sell you stuff and there's no aftercare whatsoever. They don't really want to know, do they? If you're broken after 6 months, it's like, go and buy another one. But, here, a little olive oil should be spread on the whetstone before using. A pen or pocket knife requires a stiff edge, and the moment it is laid flat on an oil stone so that the polished side of the blade touches the stone, the edge is ruined. The blade must be held at an angle to the stone of 20 to 25 degrees and have an edge similar to a chisel. And so it goes on. So yeah, again, I just think, and then the other thing is, I've got a couple of sharpening stones at home, and one of them is almost like, it's totally curved. It's almost like conical. I sometimes think, that's quite awkward for sharpening a blade. But then at the bottom I saw this, to sharpen a gardener's pruning knife, for blades with a curved edge, a whetstone with a rounded edge must be used. But I just think, just that notion about, not only are we going to sell you a knife, we're going to tell you about how to look after it. And actually sometimes I think, if you bought one of these knives, there would have been a paper inside the box that would have said, this is what you need to do, look after it. But sadly, I suspect people in those days were the same as people are now and probably didn't read the instructions. And I suspect also in that day, there'd been a lot of people who wouldn't have been capable of reading the instructions. So yeah. So that was the first half. This is the second half listing. Farmer's stock knife and clams, erasing knives, magneto knives, farrier's knives, Girl Guide knives, Boy Scout knives, service knives, 2-blade pocket knives, 2-blade pen knives, 3 and 4-blade knives, ladies' pen knives. You know, a point of sale display, again, you know, you'd have got, so here I suppose these things would have gone to your average, I don't know, DIY shop, knife shop. I've just been to France recently, and every town has got a knife shop. Every rural market has got 1, 2 or 3 stalls selling knives. I suppose we just think what might have been. But again, obviously here you've got the Royal Crest, you've got their Encore brand, they were at the Suffolk Works in Sheffield, and you know, that was the choice. And actually, 23 shillings and 6pence, so they were, yeah, each. It's funny, I don't know why, but at one point I was sorting some of the knives out, and I just thought, you know, there's a 5pence piece then, just the range of sizes. How do we organise our collection? Do we organise it by maker? Do we organise by function? Do we organise it by size? And if you do it in different ways, then you get different things happening. Something we haven't mentioned, obviously sometimes you get a fixture on the end of a knife where you could actually attach it to a belt, which some people would have actually found useful. I know there's one there that sort of fourth from this side that I was looking at that the other day. I was thinking, is this leather? Is this a leather handle? We think it was wood, but again, sometimes you can look at these objects and think, you know, what were they? What were they for? The sportsman's and angler's knives, this was almost the invitation to say, put as much on at the end of one of these as you can. And this is where you do get, you know, the thing to get the thing out of a horse's hoof, that big hook on the big hook on there. At some point, screwdrivers started to appear in there. You've got things for making holes in leather. But, you know, it's almost limitless, the number of different attachments. And one of the funs of looking at this is you look at some of the attachments and think, what were they for? And I suppose the modern parlance is you can use it for anything you want now, but at the time it would have had a distinct purpose. And if you wanted something for that purpose, you would have gone for it. This is a knife we've got in the collection. And I just started taking the blades out, and then I realised on the end there were all these little bits you could pull out. And you've got a little pair of scissors, you've got a needle, you've got a little pair of tongs in there. And I suppose it just left me thinking, what if that isn't a Swiss Army knife, I don't know what is. Why didn't we dominate the market for Swiss Army knives? What went wrong? All over the world now, you'll go and people will be buying a Swiss Army knife. Was it the branding? I don't know. Was it all these companies were busy fighting with each other? Was it I know what it is. It was probably almost certainly price. At the end of the day, people want something that's cheaper, and the things in Sheffield that were made by hand were actually more expensive. But you know, it does just feel like you could have settled on a certain type of knife with a certain number of attachments, and you could maybe have, you know, hit that world market. But it never actually, we never actually did it. I mean, despite the fact, you know, people in America pay an awful lot of money for a Sheffield pocket knife. There's some things we forget about. Smokers' knives. Again, my dad used to smoke a pipe, and there was always that sense of, you know, tapping down the tobacco and cleaning out, you know, pipe cleaners and anything else. So there was a whole load of gadgets that were just for smoking. And sometimes we look at these things and in isolation and we forget how many people used to smoke a pipe in those days. And it's almost a function that's become redundant. Again, tortoiseshell, ivory, pearl, buffalo. Obviously, sometime along the line, stainless steel came in. So that gave you another angle to say, oh, more hygienic, easier to clean, doesn't rust. So that became another bit of the sales pitch, if you like. And I was quite pleased to sort of take the full circle that in this catalogue of 1926, there was still a page, be it only a page, of sterling silver-bladed fruit knives. It's that sort of, from 1750 right through to 1926. Sheffield was sort of selling attractive fruit knives. Just a few unusual things in the collection. So we're back to the comb again. This one a bit safer because there's just the comb and nothing else. I think actually I read somewhere that it was probably for pets. And I've got this picture of some sort of aristocratic lady with a white poodle sitting on her lap, gently, combing the fur. I mean, it could have been for hair, I don't know, but I think that sounds more likely. And then you got these shoe-shaped. You get shoe-shaped knives, you get rifle-shaped knives. Again, if you wanted to sell it, you wanted to catch somebody's eye. And these were actually smoker's knives. I think it actually says on one of them, it's actually a smoker's knife. But again, you sort of see the object and then you have to start thinking, what was that for? What might it be for? A couple of other slightly unusual ones. That one on the left is tortoise shell, but it's got a big hole in it and it's got a blade on it. And that was for cutting the end off a cheroot. Okay, again, don't see too many people smoking cheroots. Had a bit of a debate with a few people about the blades that aren't metal at all. There's a couple of things. Sometimes librarians had page turners. Well, anybody could have had a page turner. The other thing, I think, it could have been it did have the ability to make a bit of a cut or a nick, and it could have been used for budding and pruning. Okay, and there's a couple of knives up there that have got that sort of combination of a metal bladed and then also an ivory handed blade. The other thing, of course, was certainly maybe in the last 100 years, pen and pocket knives were often giveaways. So we've got this with Mossman Brothers compliments. It was an interesting shaped knife with a very, certainly not got a pointed end that has it. I'm not, looks like you could probably spread butter on toast with that, but I'm not sure. And I've no idea who Mossman Brothers were, but that notion of advertising pen and pocket knives is quite interesting. We've got 3 or 4 boards in Hawley, of Sheffield made scales between 1950 and 1940 that were literally just for advertising for companies. And again, you forget, there's some company somewhere that was maybe just making the scales out of metal to put advertising on that they then give to another company who would make the rest of the knives, and maybe somebody else might even assemble it. So I don't think you can ever make that assumption that obviously at the end, Stan Shaw was making every bit of the knife and doing every bit of the process himself. But actually, I think there would have been a time when different companies would have been doing different things. And nowadays, if you get to a car boot sale or whatever, you'll see an awful lot of advertising knives that might be around and might be available. Just where can you find out more? This book, Pocket Fruit Knives, is great. If you're into pocket fruit knives, I picked that copy up for a tenner on the internet, written by Simon Moore. He's got a book about spoons, which I'd like to acquire. He's done a little bit book about pen and folding knives, which you can buy now. I think it's less than a tenner. And Michael Dyson, the guy who knows an awful lot about the cutlers at Stannington, you can buy that on Amazon. And Michael sometimes does do talks about the rural cutlers of Stannington. Just a few acknowledgements. So Michael Dyson knows about the Stannington cutlers, but Michael was instrumental in us getting the Dennis Smith knife collection. And really those two together, couldn't have done this talk without those physical objects. Simon Moore gave us the knives out of the river, loads of expert knowledge. Jeff Tweedale, who's the definitive person about, collecting information about Sheffield cutlery companies. And of course, Ken Hawley, who was the collector's inspiration. And there are still some aspects of Ken's collection that we've never managed to even acquire, never mind catalogue, that will be coming to us. So there's still more. And most collectors keep their best stuff at home. So there's more coming our way. Obviously, we've still got the Digital Knife Archive, which we're adding to all the time. Quite flattering that this auction tomorrow of £200,000 worth of Sheffield knives, they've actually put our digital knife information, saying if anybody wants to find out any more information about these companies, please have a look on our knife tool, which is now, I don't know, we've had over 200,000 hits on that. And the other thing, we've got the YouTube channel where this talk will go on, but all the other talks we've done, and that gets something like 5,000 hits a month. And we're up to nearly 350,000 hits. So I think that's all I've got to say. Yeah.